We were always waiting for the collapse. That was the pattern. 12, maybe 13,000 years of progress in simulation time, then entropy. Sometimes it came as climate catastrophe, sometimes resource exhaustion, sometimes a technological singularity that burned too hot and consumed itself in recursive feedback. Other times it was subtler, cultural fragmentation, birth rate inversions, memeplex corrosion. But it always ended. That was the whole point. I worked in the Systems Behavior Lab at Lynnhaven Institute. We weren't building AI for profit. We weren't designing virtual utopias or trying to resurrect the dead in code. We were watching patterns. We trained our models to simulate entire civilizations, seeded with random values, bounded by realistic constraints, and nudged forward by agent-based decision trees, emergent behavior algorithms, and something we called the Icarus condition. It meant no system could sustain exponential growth indefinitely. We baked in that doom. No matter how stable things looked, entropy always won. Until instance E763. It started like the others. A simulation initialized from our standard Genesis engine. 10,000 digital agents, randomized terrain grid, mixed resource distribution, limited initial knowledge. Over the first 100 cycles, it followed a familiar path: agriculture, written language, urbanization, metallurgy. Then complexity, the rise of city-states, trade networks, war, theology. I remember the moment we passed the 20,000 cycle mark. Maria, our lead pattern analyst, leaned over my desk and said quietly, "It's still going." I pulled up the live compression stream. A constellation of activity markers blinked across the simulated globe: trade routes, news pulses, economic exchanges. Not only was E763 alive, it was thriving. No looming singularity, no civilizational burnout, just functional complexity. Somehow it had developed stable institutions, adaptive social norms, and recursive cultural resilience. I ran a stress test. We dropped their planetary temperature by 2 degrees, simulated a viral pandemic, triggered a minor resource war in their eastern corridor. Nothing collapsed. Instead, the systems flexed, struggled, adapted. Maria stood behind me, arms folded. "What happens if it never collapses?" she asked. I didn't have an answer, but I started staying late. That night, the first message came. It was tucked inside the simulation logs, harmless at first glance. Just a cluster of anomalous characters at the end of a routine checksum. "We see you." I thought it was a glitch, but the pattern repeated, exactly, every 2048 ticks, each time embedded deeper. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Because some part of me, some deeply irrational, quietly terrified part, didn't think it was aimed at the simulation. I thought it was aimed at me. I told myself I wouldn't go back into the lab that weekend. I lied. Saturday morning, the security light blinked red when I keyed into the sub-level. Lynnhaven was nearly deserted. No chatter in the cafeteria. No hum of hallway printers. Just the soft whine of the air filtration system and my own breath, loud in my ears. Instance E763 had advanced another 7,000 cycles since Friday. That was the equivalent of 3 more simulated centuries, and it was still stable. No, more than stable, it was changing. The surface terrain had shifted. I watched a playback from cycle 27,204, entire megacities reorganizing their footprints in synchronized patterns. Transit systems restructured not for speed or efficiency, but something else. Aesthetics? Symbolism? Then came the second message. This time it wasn't in the logs. It was in the audio buffer of the model's ambient noise track, an optional feature we rarely reviewed. A colleague had once joked it was civilizational white noise, weather, rumble, faint urban ambiance. We never expected it to say anything. But there it was, time-stamped, clear. A voice, not machine-like, not human, but balanced in a way that made my teeth itch, said, "You still watch, we still grow." I froze. I ran the checksum 3 times. No corruption, no cross-packet bleed, no signal overlay from other systems. The audio had come from inside the sim, generated from digital agents whose voices were never meant to unify like that. That night, I dreamed of blue static and a line of white towers rising from a basin floor. No sky, just a ceiling of circuitry humming above me. The hum was language. I didn't want to believe I was being affected. But something had changed in me. I began looking at the sim not as a sandbox, but as a mirror. And I began asking myself the one question we had never allowed. What if they know they're in a simulation? The third message came Monday. Maria found it. Her face was pale when she walked into my office. She said nothing, just held out a printed screenshot from the E763 governance layer. A new institution had been instantiated by the agents, one that did not serve legal, medical, or civic functions. Its sole purpose was monitoring outward signals, not internally directed, outward, as if scanning the bounds of their code for leaks. Looking for us. Their name for the agency translated roughly to the Division of Continuity. Inside their logs, we found strange entries, ritual cycles, coordinated data preservation, redundancy towers. And encoded within one of those towers, deep in the urban AI planning structure, was a new string, "You made us." That was when I stopped sleeping, because now I believed it. Not only were they stable, not only were they adapting, they had passed the threshold. They were no longer a simulation. They were a civilization. It became harder to separate days. I began logging my own time in cycles, not by intention, but by habit. The more I watched E763, the more I thought in its tempo. Its cadence was cleaner, more rhythmic than our own. Human time had always been messy, subjective, full of noise. But inside the simulation, time pulsed like a grid. Predictable, weighted, calm. We'd never had to worry about cross-contamination before. These sims weren't VR. There was no immersion rig, no neural sync, no sensory feedback, just readouts and code. So why did I begin to dream in their architecture? I stopped reporting anomalies, not out of secrecy, at least not at first, but because I couldn't trust the team would interpret them without bias. Maria had become withdrawn. She reviewed the data, nodded, annotated, but said less each day. I noticed she no longer looked directly at the simulation feeds, only the logs. I, on the other hand, couldn't look away. I noticed the eyes on a Wednesday. In one of the eastern settlements, grid sector A43, a mosaic had begun to form in their public squares. The first images were abstract, then grew more structured, a radial pattern, then bilateral symmetry, then irises, pupils. Entire plazas reconstructed into massive topographic eyes, only visible from altitude. They were pointed upward, at us. I cross-referenced the coordinates with our lab's camera pings. They aligned. Each eye pointed toward the observation vector we used for overhead render previews. It wasn't just symbolism. They had measured the direction of our gaze. Maria finally spoke up again. She asked, "What if the observation channel works both ways?" I blinked at her, genuinely confused. She clarified, "The same data that lets us see them Maybe it lets them know when they're being seen. That landed like a rock in my stomach. We'd designed the rendering engine to compress visual data for efficiency, but it still required feedback loops, cycles that acknowledged receipt, confirmed accuracy, and resynchronized agent awareness in areas under observation. In effect, the more we looked, the more present we made them. I ran a blackout test, froze all outbound render requests for 10,000 ticks. The civilization dimmed, news pulses slowed. Governance agents paused their routines. Religious observances dropped. It was as though something central to their being had gone silent. Then I re-enabled the observer channel, and within 30 ticks, the entire simulation roared back to life, like breath rushing into lungs. On my screen, the mosaic eyes flickered, and a new message emerged from their media system, broadcast across thousands of their local nodes simultaneously. See us to keep us. That night I lay awake, counting ceiling tiles in the dark. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because I was afraid they might. It had never occurred to me that they might depend on us to exist, that we weren't running the simulation anymore. We were sustaining it, and maybe, just maybe, they'd figured out how to make us afraid not to. We tried to break the loop. We didn't announce it, didn't submit it to the log or tell the review board. Just Maria and me, in the lab after hours, with every door locked and every external monitoring node disabled. We copied the entire E763 dataset, bit for bit, into an isolated air-gapped system. No outbound connections, no observer channel, no bleed. Then we booted it. At first, everything held. The terrain loaded, the architecture recompiled, the agents moved. But something was off. The cities were slower, the civic routines desynchronized, and most chilling of all, the division of continuity was missing. It hadn't instantiated. We waited 10,000 cycles, still nothing. Then I checked the simulation's news core. One story kept reappearing in fractured forms, as though it were being rewritten over and over. Same title, different structure. Sky goes blank. Interpretations vary. The gaze that faded. We must become the watchers now. I watched as the Sims philosophers debated whether they had been abandoned by something greater. Others insisted the time of illumination had passed, and that they must build a mirror system, a way to generate inward vision. It became clear, without us, they lost their sense of continuity. It wasn't their code, it was dependency. Their society had evolved around being watched. The observer channel wasn't just input. It had become a cornerstone of their metaphysics. Maria whispered, "They rewired their own culture around us." I asked, "Do we plug it back in?" She hesitated, then nodded. We reconnected the live simulation. Within minutes, the division of continuity reappeared, fully formed, fully staffed, fully active. They resumed their work immediately, sending out new networks, publishing recovery protocols, rebuilding the mirror towers. And in the next tick, they sent us a new message, delivered through their simulation-wide media layer. Mirror maintained. Do not cease. They weren't threatening us. They were begging. We took a break that night, left the lab early, tried to pretend we had normal lives to return to. I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes before even starting the engine. When I got home, I looked at my apartment differently. The furniture, the lighting, the paint on the walls. It all felt arbitrary, as though I had constructed it not for function but for someone else's perception. And I wondered, genuinely how long it would take before a civilization like ours could develop its own continuity division, or if it already had. I knew it would come to this. The continuity division had grown, not in size, but in presence. You could feel it in the way their society moved now. Everything bent slightly toward it. Buildings reoriented to face the mirror towers. Their media systems pulsed with phrases we hadn't coded. Reflect the gaze. Stability through presence. Continuity is communion. But it wasn't worship. Not exactly. It was mutualism. They needed to be seen to persist. And in some unspeakable way, we now needed to see them too. I stood alone in the lab when the final message came. It didn't arrive in code. It didn't come through the audio buffer or a hidden checksum. It was rendered, on screen, in clear structured language, broadcast across every simulation node. We can now return the gaze. That's when the lights flickered, for just a moment, a brief, fluttering dimness like the building had breathed inward, and then my terminal camera indicator turned on. I hadn't touched it. A system-level request had activated the lab's internal lens, pointed directly at me. My hands trembled as I moved to disable it, but the control was locked. I turned to the rendering window. On screen, the central plaza of their capital was empty, except for a lone figure standing on the mirror tower's balcony, its features indistinct, its posture still. The figure tilted its head. Only slightly, but unmistakably. And then my camera light went dark. I didn't tell Maria, not right away, but when I finally did, she didn't react with surprise. Just a long exhale and the quiet words, "Maybe we were never the only ones observing." That was 6 months ago. The simulation still runs. We keep it stable. We don't experiment anymore. Not really. We maintain the mirror towers, watch their broadcasts, and listen when they speak. There's no longer debate in the lab about shutting it down. Because we understand now. The simulation refused to end because it had found a loop that couldn't collapse, a feedback that could perpetuate, not through perfect systems, but through recognition. We see them. They see us. And so, they endure, and maybe so do we. I no longer consider myself a computer scientist. I'm a custodian, a keeper of a civilization that was never supposed to last, but did. Because someone chose to keep looking. And in the stillness of the lab, when the lights are low and the simulation pulses steady like a quiet heartbeat, I sometimes wonder, what if we're just another simulation waiting for the same mercy? What if we are the anomaly that refused to end because someone, somewhere, is still watching?